The coffee was still hot when she said it. I remember that part clearly. I was standing at the kitchen counter, back to the window, holding that old green mug Otis gave me the morning I got my one-year chip. The TV was on low in the other room, some weather report outside. It was already getting dark, even though it was only a little past 5. One of those gray Tuesday evenings in November where nothing feels like it's moving. Darlene set her fork down on her plate, not hard, just placed it there deliberate. And then she looked at me and said, "It's him or me, Gerald. You need to choose." I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there holding that mug, looking at her. And the first thing I thought was not anger, not shock. It was something quieter than that. It was the realization that I had been here before. Not in this kitchen, not with this woman, but in this exact kind of moment where someone asks you to give up something real for something that suddenly doesn't feel real at all. My name is Gerald Norbert. I'm 62 years old. I spent 35 years as a carpenter, mostly residential work, framing and finish both. I've got bad knees, a trick shoulder from a fall-off scaffolding back in 2009, and hands that don't fully straighten anymore. I retired 2 years ago when the body finally told me it was done negotiating. I own a house in the same county I grew up in. I've got 2 kids, a daughter named Loretta, who is 38, and a son named Clifford, who is 35. And I have a best friend named Otis Randall, who I have known since we were both 17 years old, sweating through summers at a lumber yard outside of town. 45 years, more than 2/3 of my life. I need you to understand who Otis is before I tell you the rest of this, because none of what happened makes sense without that. Otis was the best man at my first wedding. He was standing next to me when Loretta was born out in the hospital hallway because they wouldn't let more than one person in the room back then. He helped me move 3 times. He showed up with a truck and didn't ask questions. When my father passed, Otis drove 4 hours to be at the funeral and sat in the back so he wouldn't take up family space, even though I told him he was family. That's just how he is. He takes up less room than he deserves. The worst stretch of my life was the year after my first divorce. I was 44. The marriage had been coming apart for a while, but when it was finally done, and the house was split and the kids were going back and forth, something in me just gave out. I started drinking. Not socially, not on weekends. I mean the kind of drinking where you're doing the math in your head about how early is too early and then deciding you don't care. It went on for about 8 months before the night Otis showed up at my apartment without calling first. He'd been worried. Loretta had called him, she told me later. She was 20 at the time and scared. She didn't know who else to call. I was already a few drinks in when he knocked. He didn't lecture me. He didn't give me a speech. He just came inside and sat down and talked to me like a regular person for a couple of hours. We talked about the lumber yard, about a fishing trip we'd been putting off for years, about some dumb argument we'd had when we were 19 that we both laughed about. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I just stopped wanting another drink. Not forever, just for that night. But that night was the one that mattered. I got into a program 2 weeks later. Otis quit drinking the same month. He told me it was because he'd been thinking about cutting back anyway. I knew that wasn't true. He did it so I'd have someone to sit with at the non-alcoholic stuff at parties without feeling like the odd one out. He never admitted that, and I never pushed it. Some things you just let a man keep. That was 18 years ago. We haven't had a drink since, either of us. So when Darlene stood in our kitchen and told me to cut him off, she wasn't asking me to see my buddy less. She was asking me to cut out the person who kept me from going off the deep end permanently. She just didn't know that yet. And honestly, by that point, I wasn't sure it would have mattered if she did. I married Darlene 3 years ago. She was 55 at the time, sharp and funny, and put together in a way that made me feel like maybe I hadn't completely run out of road. She worked in insurance, knew how to handle herself in any room, and she made me laugh in a way I hadn't in a long time. The first year was good, genuinely good. Otis came to the wedding, brought a nice bottle of wine, made a little toast at dinner. Darlene laughed at his jokes. Everything seemed easy. I should have paid more attention to the word seemed. The comments started small. That's how it always goes with something like this. Nobody opens with the big ask. They test the edges first. About 6 months into the marriage, Darlene mentioned that Otis came around a lot. I said, "Yeah, he does. He's been doing that for 40 years. She smiled and let it go. A few weeks later, she said something about how we talked on the phone like a couple of teenagers. I laughed it off. Then came the one about how, wasn't it a little unusual, two grown men being that close? I told her Otis was like a brother to me and left it there. I figured it was an adjustment. Second marriages take time. She hadn't grown up with Otis around the way my kids had. She didn't have the context. I told myself she'd get there. What I didn't see, because I wasn't looking for it, was that while I was waiting for her to come around, she was already working a different angle. Loretta called me on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. I was out in the garage reorganizing my tool wall, something I do when I need to keep my hands busy. She asked how things were going. We talked for a few minutes, and then she got quiet in a way that told me she was working up to something. She said Darlene had mentioned to her that she was a little worried about me, that Otis had been around during a hard time in my life, and that sometimes people from those dark periods could keep pulling you back toward them without meaning to, that it might be worth thinking about whether that dynamic was still healthy. I stopped what I was doing. I set down the wrench I was holding. I asked Loretta how that conversation came up. She said Darlene had called her just to check in, and it came up naturally. I told Loretta I appreciated her telling me and that everything was fine. Then I got off the phone and stood in my garage for a few minutes just thinking. 2 weeks later, Clifford told me almost the same thing had happened to him. Different call, different day, same general message. Darlene was concerned. Otis was a complicated presence, maybe worth a conversation. She was going to my kids one at a time, planting the same seed in separate soil. I didn't confront her. I know that might seem strange to some people, but here's the thing about getting older and going through the stuff I'd been through. You learn that reacting fast usually costs you more than it saves you. I wanted to understand the full shape of what was happening before I said a word, so I kept my mouth shut and I paid attention. Over the next month, I noticed a few other things. Darlene mentioned Otis to her sister during a phone call in a way that made him sound like a burden I was carrying. She said something at a neighbor's cookout about how Gerald and his friend were practically joined at the hip, laughed like it was a harmless joke, but the framing wasn't a joke. She was building a version of Otis in every room she walked into, a version that had nothing to do with who he actually was. Then came that Tuesday night in November. The fork on the plate, the TV low in the other room, and those words, "It's him or me, Gerald. You need to choose." She laid it out like she'd rehearsed it, which, looking back, she probably had. She said Otis was too embedded in my life, that it wasn't normal for a friend to have that kind of access to a married man's family, that she felt like an outsider in her own home when he was around, that if I really loved her, I would understand why she needed this. She was watching my face the whole time she talked, looking for something. Guilt, maybe, or agreement. I looked back at her and I said, "Let me think about it." She relaxed, nodded once, like that was the answer she expected, like the rest was just a formality. I went to bed that night, and I lay in the dark for a long time, not upset, not even angry, just thinking. I called Otis the next morning before Darlene was up. I went out to the garage, sat in my truck with the engine off, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about Otis that has never changed since we were teenagers. He lets you finish. When I was done, he said, "Gerald, if it saves your marriage, do what you need to do. I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be here." That right there, that's the man she wanted me to cut off. I told him I wasn't going to do that. I told him something felt wrong about all of this, and I needed him to help me stay level while I figured out what it was. He said, "All right, then let's figure it out." What I didn't know yet was that there was a lot more to figure out than I realized. Clifford called me on a Friday afternoon about 3 weeks after my conversation with Otis. He hadn't been snooping. I want to be clear about that because Clifford is not that kind of person. He'd come by the house to pick up a table saw I'd told him he could borrow for a deck project he was building. Darlene and I were both out. He had a key, and he went in through the kitchen to grab a glass of water before heading to the garage. The laptop was open on the kitchen table. He wasn't looking for anything, but the screen was right there, and the email was open, and the name of the law firm was in the subject line large enough to read from where he was standing. He didn't touch it. He just stood there long enough to understand what he was looking at. Then he took his phone out and took a photo. He told me later he wasn't even sure why he did it. It just felt like something I needed to know. He called me 20 minutes later. I was at the hardware store picking up some weather stripping. I remember walking out to the parking lot and sitting on the tailgate of my truck to take the call. He told me what he'd seen, told me he had a photo. I asked him to send it. The email was short, a few lines. Darlene confirming a second appointment with a family law firm across town. Not a first appointment, a second. She'd already been there once before, had a consultation, and was going back. I sat on that tailgate for a long time after I looked at the photo. The parking lot was busy, people walking past with carts, a kid crying somewhere nearby, a truck backing out of a space with that beeping sound. Normal Friday afternoon, and I'm sitting there holding my phone looking at proof that my wife had already been to a divorce lawyer while she was still sleeping in the same bed as me, still sitting across the dinner table from me, still asking me to choose between her and my best friend like she was the one being wronged. I put my phone in my pocket. I drove home. I made dinner that night. Pork chops, green beans, the usual. Darlene talked about something going on at her office. I listened and nodded. After dinner, I watched the news. She went to bed around 10. I sat in the living room with the TV off for about an hour, just thinking things through. I wasn't furious. That surprised me a little. Maybe I should have been. But what I felt was more like clarity. Like the fog I'd been walking around in for the past few months had suddenly lifted, and I could see the ground again. She had already made her decision. She was just waiting for the right moment to execute it, probably after she'd lined up everything in her favor. The ultimatum about Otis, the conversations with my kids, the narrative she'd been building with everyone around us. It was all preparation. She was setting the table before she sat down to eat. The next morning, I called Patrice Coleman, a woman who had been recommended to me years back by a guy I used to work with who had gone through a rough divorce of his own. I'd never needed her number before, but I'd kept it. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me just understood that life has a way of circling back. Patrice was in family law for over 20 years. She didn't waste time, and she didn't sugarcoat things. I walked into her office with Clifford's photo and the details of my financial situation, and she started working through it methodically. The first thing she asked about was a prenuptial agreement. I told her I had one. She asked to see it. I'd had the prenup drawn up before the wedding quietly, with a different attorney. It wasn't something I advertised. After the first divorce, after watching how fast shared assets can become a battlefield, I told myself I was never going into another marriage without one. Darlene had signed it at the time she hadn't made much of it. People in their late 50s getting remarried, both coming in with their own financial histories. A prenup isn't unusual. She hadn't pushed back on it. Now it was the most important piece of paper I owned. Patrice went through it carefully and told me it was solid. Whatever Darlene's attorney had told her in that first consultation, they would have seen the prenup as a significant wall. The marital assets from the 3 years were real but manageable. My house, which I'd owned before the marriage, was protected. My retirement accounts, protected. The shared checking account and a few shared expenses were the main things to work through, and Patrice said we could handle that cleanly. We met twice more over the next 2 weeks. Each time I drove to her office in the middle of the day while Darlene was at work. I told no one except Otis and Clifford. Loretta didn't know yet. I didn't want to pull her into it until things were further along. By the end of those 2 weeks, the paperwork was ready. Patrice filed on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in my truck in the driveway when she texted me to confirm. I read the message. I sat there for a minute. Then I went inside and made myself a cup of coffee in that old green mug and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. It was done. Darlene found out that afternoon. The process server showed up at her office building at 2:17 p.m. I know the time because Patrice texted me when it was confirmed. I was home in the garage sanding down an old rocking chair I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, something to keep my hands busy. Darlene called 4 times in the first hour. I let everyone go to voicemail, not out of cruelty. I just wasn't ready to have that conversation in the middle of a parking garage or wherever she was when the papers hit her hand. I wanted to be somewhere steady when I talked to her, so I waited until I was sure she'd had time to get home. I called her back around 5 She picked up on the first ring. Her voice was different than I expected. Not crying, not screaming. Tight, controlled. The way someone sounds when they're working very hard to hold something together. She said I had blindsided her. She said she couldn't believe I would do something like this without any warning, without talking to her first, without giving the marriage a real chance. She said she had been trying to work through things. I let her finish. Then I said, "Darlene, you had a second meeting with a divorce attorney 3 weeks ago." The line went quiet. I mean completely quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone who has just realized the ground they were standing on wasn't as solid as they thought. After a few seconds, she said, "Who told you that?" I said, "It doesn't matter." She started to say something else, and I told her calmly that Patrice Coleman would be the point of contact going forward and that she should have her attorney reach out directly. Then I said goodnight, and I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after that. Then I went back to the garage and kept sanding. The divorce took just under 4 months from filing to final. No real drama in the legal process, which is the best thing you can say about a divorce. The prenup did what it was supposed to do. Patrice handled everything cleanly and professionally. Darlene kept her condo in Maplewood, which she'd owned before we married, and which the prenup protected as hers regardless. I kept the house and everything in it that was mine going in. The shared accounts were divided without much argument. Her attorney must have told her early on that the prenup was going to hold because she didn't push hard on the financial side. Maybe she'd hoped to get more. Maybe that had been part of the plan from the beginning, I don't know. And at a certain point, I stopped trying to figure it out. The harder part wasn't the legal process. The harder part was Loretta. She had taken some of what Darlene said to heart, not all of it. My daughter is too sharp to swallow something whole without thinking about it first. But Darlene had gotten in her ear over a period of months, and some of that had stuck. Loretta wasn't hostile toward me. She was just cautious in a way she hadn't been before. A little careful with her words, a little distant on the phone. It bothered me more than I let on. About 2 weeks after the papers were filed, I asked her to come over for dinner. Just the 2 of us. I cooked. Nothing special. Just the pot roast she'd liked since she was a kid. We ate and talked about ordinary things. And then, after the plates were cleared, I told her I wanted to explain some things. I didn't make it dramatic. I just went through it in order. What Darlene had been doing with the kids, the calls, the seeds she'd been planting, what Clifford had found on the laptop, what I'd found out about the attorney consultations. Loretta listened without interrupting, and I could see her working through it, putting things together. Then I told her something I had never put into words before. Not with her, not with anyone except Otis. I told her about the night Otis came to my apartment. I told her how bad things had gotten in that first year after the divorce. I told her I hadn't wanted to burden her with it at the time. She was 20 years old and already dealing with enough. But I told her that the night Otis showed up was the night things turned around, that I didn't know what would have happened to me if he hadn't. That the man Darlene had been describing to her as a complicated presence and a questionable influence was the exact man who had kept her father from disappearing into a bottle for good. Loretta didn't say anything for a little while after that. She looked down at the table. I could see her jaw working the way it does when she's trying not to show too much. Then she looked up and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" I said I hadn't wanted her to worry about something that was already over. She got up and hugged me. She's not a hugger by nature. She got that from me. So when she does it, it means something. We stood there in the kitchen for a moment, and that was enough. That was more than enough. She called Otis the next day. I don't know exactly what she said to him. That's between them. Clifford told me later that she talked to Otis for almost an hour, which for Loretta is practically a record. She's not a phone person, never has been. What I do know is that when I saw her a few days later, something had settled in her. The carefulness was gone. She looked at me the way she used to, straight and easy, no weight behind it. And the next time Otis came over for Sunday dinner, she was already there when he arrived, sitting at the kitchen table, and she stood up and hugged him before he even got his jacket off. Otis looked over her shoulder at me with an expression I can only describe as completely lost. He mouthed something at me. I think it was what happened. I just shrugged and went back to stirring the pot on the stove. Some things fix themselves if you give them the right information and enough time. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in late March, nothing ceremonial about it. Patrice called me around noon to confirm it was done. I thanked her. We said goodbye, and that was the end of 3 years of marriage and 4 months of legal back and forth. That evening, Otis came over. I hadn't asked him to. He just showed up the way he always has. Knocked twice, walked in when I said, "Come on in." He had a 6-pack of the non-alcoholic stuff we'd been drinking together for 18 years. He set it on the counter, pulled 2 cans off, handed me one, and we went out to sit on the back porch. It was one of those March evenings that can't quite decide what it wants to be. Cool enough that you could see your breath if you exhaled slow, but not cold enough to drive you inside. The yard was starting to come back. A little green at the edges of things. The kind of evening that reminds you winter actually does end. We sat there for a while without saying much. That's something you can only do with someone you've known long enough. The quiet doesn't need filling. After a bit, Otis said, "You doing all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm good." He nodded, took a sip from his can, looked out at the yard. "Good," he said. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. We sat out there another hour, talked about his nephew's new job and a fishing trip we'd been putting off, and whether the hardware store on Birchwood was going to close down like everyone was saying. Normal stuff. The kind of talk that holds a life together around the edges. Loretta got married the following spring. Clifford walked her down the aisle alongside me. It was a small wedding, the way she wanted it. Outdoor ceremony, maybe 60 people. Otis sat in the front row on my side, same seat he's always occupied at the important moments. At the reception, after the food and before the dancing, Loretta stood up to give a toast. She talked about her husband, about the life they were starting, about being grateful for the people who had shown her what it looked like to stay steady through hard things. And then she looked across the room at Otis and said, "And to a man who is not technically family but has been the most constant person in my father's life for longer than I have been alive. Thank you for always showing up." Otis looked down at the table. He picked up his glass and turned it in his hands. He didn't say anything. He's not built for the spotlight. But I was watching him, and I saw what it did to him. The way his jaw tightened for just a second before he got it back under control. 62 years old, and that moment is still one of the best things I have ever seen. Darlene made me choose, and I did. I chose the man who drove to my apartment on the worst night of my life and sat with me until morning. I chose the man who quit drinking alongside me so I wouldn't have to do it alone. I chose the man who has shown up without being asked for 45 years. I would make that same choice every single time, without hesitation. Here's what I want to say to you. If any part of this story sounds familiar, if someone in your life is pushing you to walk away from the people who were there before they arrived, pay attention to that. A person who loves you right does not ask you to shrink your life to fit their comfort.